Masechet Baba Kama Daf Mem. Tenor Banan Apotropsin Mishalamin Min Ha'aliyah Ven Mishalamin Kofer. If you have an estate that's owned by a minor and the court appoints a steward to take care of it, and in the estate there's a shor mu'ad that goes and gores and causes damage, so someone definitely has to pay, and according to this Braita, it's the apotropos that has to pay from his own superior land. We saw yesterday there were two opinions about this, whether the apotropos pays himself, and then when the kids grow up, he can then collect money back from the estate, or whether he is permitted to take land or money from the estate to pay it. So according to this Braita, the apotropos, he was delegated to be responsible, and he should have made sure that the ox is being cared for and guarded, and so therefore he has to pay. In the meantime, we're not yet authorized to take the money from the estate. That's the first halacha. The second halacha that we're going to focus on is if an ox that owned by a estate goes and gores and kills a person. So normally, if there's just a regular adult owner, that owner is liable to the death penalty from the letter of the law. But this is the one case where he can get out of the death penalty by paying an amount which would be the ransom for his life. But in the case where they are minors and apotropos, then nobody pays the kofer. The minors don't pay because they're not they're minors, so they don't need atonement, right? We're going to see for in a second that this is kofer for atonement for their sin, so the minors don't have to pay, and the apotropos also does not have to pay because he's paying on behalf of the minors, and the minors don't have to pay, and he's not responsible because he's not the owner, so he doesn't need atonement either. And therefore, although an apotropos does have to pay for damages, that is different because damages, there's someone here that has a loss of and needs to get paid. So one way or another, apotropos will pay it here and then he'll get the money later. But in terms of atonement, there's nobody that requires atonement, and atonement, the kofer is not paid. Okay, now we ask, who would be the author of this baraita who assumes that this ransom payment is for atonement? You see, there's two opinions. One we're going to see. One says that ransom payment is atonement. Another one says that it's monetary restitution. If it's monetary restitution, nizikin, then they'll be the same as the first case, where it's like a shor mu'ad that pays. The apotropos would have to pay. So this obviously is referring to the other opinion that says that the kofer's ransom amount is not monetary restitution for a loss, but rather is atonement for the owner. And since it is atonement, and the orphans who are minors are not subject to the law of atonement, they don't need atonement because they are not morally responsible, they're not of age, and therefore no kofer needs to be paid. So who thinks all these things and would be the author of this baraita? Amad Rav Chisda Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. Rav Chisda says must be Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, as we see in the following baraita. Detanya v'natan pijon nafsho demei nizak. Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka omer demei mazik. Regarding the pasuk of this case, that an owner of an ox that kills someone, he would get the death penalty, but he can give a redemption for his life. Pijon nafsho, who is the pronoun of nafsho? It's a machloket. Tanakama says demei nizak. We evaluate the worth of the victim who was killed, and if it's a young person, an old person, the payment is dependent on their worth. Whereas Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, says no, it's the nafsho refers to the one giving it, which seems to be the simple reading. Venatan, that's the person giving. Pidyon nafsho, the pronoun should go on him. And so is the value of the mazik. We evaluate him if he's old or young and weak and strong, and depending on what his worth is, that's how much he has to pay. Now, what's that essence? It's not just what the pronoun is. What's at the essence of their machloket? Maila behakami palged Rabbanan sabre kufra mamonahu v'Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka sabar kufra kapara. It seems that they're divided along this very line. That Tanakama, that's Rabbanan, they say that the ransom payment is monetary restitution. So it depends on how much damage was done. Just like with damages, if there's a lot of damage, you have to pay more. Little damage, you pay less. So too, if the ox kills someone, so we evaluate the victim. Of course, every life is an infinite value and all that, but in legal terms, this was done, by not by a person themselves, but by their shor. So therefore, it is possible to redeem a person, but nevertheless, it is a monetary restitution, and so it depends on the value of the person, the market value, and on a slave market, how much would this person be worth? So it depends on how much the nizak was worth, because it is in fact damages. So it could be more or less depending on that, because it's monetary restitution. It's nizakin. Whereas Rabbi Ishmael thinks that it's atonement. Since it's atonement, if I'm the owner, I need atonement. I need atonement for my life. Really, I should give my life. I'm paying instead for the value of my life. So therefore, I'm going to evaluate it depending on my value. If I'm young and strong or weak and old and whatever. So it depends on the value of the redemption. And therefore, Rav Chisda says the author of this baraita would be Rabbi Ishmael, who thinks that we follow the mazik, and the ransom is for the sake of atonement, and children do not need atonement, and that's why the apotropos does not have to pay anything. Amar Papa la. So this is actually a little problematic, because that means that this baraita is going with a minority opinion of Rabbi Ishmael. Is there a way we can explain it according to everyone? Yes. Amar Papa la de kula alma kufra kaparahu. Papa says, in fact, everybody agrees that the ransom is for atonement, and therefore everyone could be the author of this baraita. Even though it's atonement, still there's a controversy about how you evaluate the atonement. Rabbanan say it's still the nizak. I'm responsible. My ox killed this person, and so I need to redeem myself from this death that I caused. So if it's a death of someone who is worth more or less, in order to redeem myself, I pay according to the value of what was damaged. So it could still be atonement even though you follow nizak. Whereas Rabbi Yishmael ben Beroka says, as we did before, it's a ransom for my own life. And therefore, I'm the one that needs the atonement, so it's we decide it based on the value of my life. But really, both of these can fit into the atonement idea. Now, my ta'ama de Rabbanan. What is the source of Rabbanan? That say we follow the nizak. Ne'emra shita lemata v'ne'emra shita lema'ala. Malalan bede nizak, afkan bede nizak. He makes a gezerah shava from two pesukim in the same perek in Shemot chapter 21. It says it regarding two men who are fighting, and they hit a pregnant woman, and they have to pay kasher yashit ba'al ha'isha. So they have to pay according to the amount, and it says the word shita. And in that context, it's obvious that it's talking about the value of the nizak, of the damage that's caused. And so, just as it says the word up there, that's the verb shita, here also it says kasher yushat alav, regarding the ox that kills a person. And so, according to that gezerah shava, just like in the case of the pregnant woman who miscarries, it's the nizak's value. So too with the ox, it's the value of the nizak. That's the source for Rabbanan. Rabbi Ishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka sabar v'natan pijon nafsho ketiv. He says, no, just look at this pasuk by itself. He says he gives the value of his life. That means the value of his own life. It's a simple reading. Rabbanan, what are you going to do about that? It says, in pijon nafsho ketiv mihu ki shaminan b'denizak shaminan. I agree that the ransom will be for his life. Really, he deserves the death penalty, so he has to ransom his life. So I agree that actually the pronoun can go on the person giving a value of his life. Nevertheless, when you come to evaluate how much that should be, in that case, I follow the gezerah shava. You want to ransom your life for killing a person? Well, you have to pay the value of that person. So just because you're paying that value doesn't mean it's damages, but rather it can still be atonement. And there that we conclude that according to everyone, the kofed is an atonement value, and therefore the children do not have to pay, and the steward did not have to pay. משבח לרבה לרב נחמן בדרב אחא בר יעקב דאדם גדול הוא אמר לכשיבוא לידך הביאהו לידי. Then we go on a tangent that's a fun story that is going to be related to some of these halachot that we mentioned. So Rava was praising Rav Achah bar Yaakov in front of Rav Nachman, his teacher. So Rava was saying, listen, Rav Nachman, there's the sage Rav Achah bar Yaakov, he's really amazing. You should meet him. And so Rav Nachman says, okay, when he comes around, bring him to visit me. I would love to meet him. So when Rav Achah came and he visited Rav Nachman said, ask me a question. I mean, normally you'd think that the teacher who meets a smart person would ask the student a question or the visitor a question. But here he's saying to ask me a question from your question. I want to see if you know how to ask a good question. You can tell someone's level of learning by seeing if they know how to ask an insightful and challenging question. So, in fact, Rav Achah had a very challenging question. Let's say you have two people who are partners and together own an ox, and the ox goes and kills a person. So now someone has to pay ransom. Who's going to pay? We're assuming, as we just concluded, that ransom is atonement. So how are you going to pay? How are two people going to pay the ransom for atonement? Mishalem hay kofer v'hay kofer. Kofer achadam rachamana v'lo shne koferin. Are both of them going to pay the value of the ransom? But the Torah says one ransom. Doesn't say two ransoms. You don't have to pay double. Hay chatzi kofer v'chatzi kofer. Kofer shalem rachamana v'lo chatzi kofer. So each one will pay half a kofer? No, but the Torah says kofer nafsho. So that means a full amount, not a half. So what is it going to be? All right, this is in fact a challenging question. So Rav Nachman is thinking about it. He's looking, he's trying to find a source, trying to find a reason. So he really got stumped. So while he's still thinking about that question, Rav Achah brings another question. And he says, look, it says in the Mishnah, Tenan, Chayave adachin memashkenin otan, Chayave chataot vashamot en memashkenin otan, Chayave kofarin mai. Now we know that if someone makes a pledge for their own worth, I give the worth of myself to the Bet HaMikdash, and there's a chart of how much you would have to give. Now, let's say the person doesn't pay it right away, and now the deadline's already coming, so the court can go after that person's property and seize their property in order to pay the arachin, to make sure that he fulfills his vow. That's true for arachin, but if a person says, I am liable to bring an animal, they take upon themselves that they need to bring a chatat or an asham because they did something wrong, and so they said, okay, I'm going to bring this animal. We do not seize their property because we assume that they're going to do it on their own. Why? Because the person wants atonement. They made some kind of sin. Everybody wants to get atonement. So if they are dedicated themselves to bringing it, they will bring it in time, and the Bet Din does not have to get involved. Okay, that's two models. And so now his question is, what about chayav kofer? If someone's ox goes and kills someone, so do we compare that to arachin, where a person might not end up paying it, and so the Bet Din has to step in, or it is for atonement, so maybe a person will pay it on their own, and the Bet Din does not have to get involved, right? What's the law? Here's the different sides of it. Because it is for atonement, so that's similar to a chatat and asham, where a person is going to be very serious about it, and don't worry, they'll bring it on his own. The Bet Din does not have to go ahead and repossess his ox or his however much he has to pay, his property, in order to pay for the value of the ransom. That's one side. Another hand is different from chatat and asham because the payment for ransom goes to the victim's family, the one who was killed. And since he's giving it to another person and he's not giving it to the Bet HaMikdash, so maybe he won't take it so seriously. Chatat and asham, right? He did some kind of sin, bishogeg, and so he's going to give this korban to the Bet HaMikdash, and so there he wants atonement from high. But this, it's more like it is a monetary payment to another person, so it feels more like just a regular payment, and therefore he may not do it without extra encouragement from the court. Or another reason, or he'll also reason to himself and say, I didn't kill someone, it was my property, my ox that is what killed someone. So he won't take the matter very seriously, and therefore the court needs to intervene. He won't really feel that guilty that he needs to actually bring atonement, unlike where Chatat and Asham, where he actually did the action. So according to that, the Bet Din would have to. Okay, good question. So Rav Nachman answers, Amar le Shivakan istagad bakamaita. He says, leave me alone. I'm still stuck on the first question that you asked me, right? I already got stumped, and I'm looking, and I'm preoccupied, and now you're adding yet another question. Anyway, Rava proved his point that Rav Acha bar Yaakov was in fact an Adam Gadol, and he already stumped Rav Nachman once, and Rav Nachman said, that's enough, right? I can't think about the second question. The Gemara does not provide answers to these good questions, but the point of the story was to show the greatness of Rav Acha. תנו רבנן, שעלו בחזקתם נמצא מועד, בעלים משלמים חצי נזק ושואל משלם חצי נזק. You have an owner who has an ox, and it is in fact a shor mu'ad, but someone comes and borrows it, assuming that it was tam. So he's under a false presumption. Now, while the borrower has it, it goes and gores a person, causes damage. So what's the law? Well, the borrower is responsible for the ox as long as he's borrowing it, right? Whatever, if something happens to it. So normally the borrower would be responsible. If it's a shor tam, the borrower would have to pay half. If it were a shor mu'ad and he knew it was a shor mu'ad, then the borrower would have to pay the entire amount. But in this case, he thought it was tam. So therefore, they split the difference. The owner has to pay half because he passed it off as a shor tam, and the shoel also has to pay half because he thought it was a shor tam, so he still has to pay half. So certainly the shoel has to pay half as a tam, and the Baal makes up the difference as a mu'ad because he didn't inform the borrower of as such. That's case number one. Second case is the opposite. Huad bebet shoel vechiziro la be'alim mishalimim hasi nezek v'shoel patur mikelum. It was a shor tam. The owner gives it to the borrower. While it's under the hands of the borrower, it gores 3 times and becomes a mu'ad. And then he gives it back to the owner. And then it gores after that under the owner. So the owner only has to pay half. This is because his ox, when he gave it, was only a shor tam. So he's still responsible, but only as a shor tam. Whereas the shoel was responsible for turning it from a tam into a mu'ad. And so therefore, we might have thought that the borrower would have to pay the other half, but the Beraita does not say that. Instead, it says the borrower does not have to. The Gemara will discuss why. The initial assumption is that because it changed hands, and we saw before that when an ox changes ownership or changes management, then it goes from being a mu'ad back to a tam. So that will be the initial reason that the Gemara will say, and we'll see more about that. Okay, Amar Mor. Let's analyze the first half first. She'alo bechezkatam nimsa mu'ad be'alim mishalimim chasi nezek v'shoel chasi nezek. If the borrower thought it was a tam, but it turns out actually it was mu'ad, so the owner has to pay half, and the borrower also has to pay half. Ve'amai lemale Torah she'ili aryeh lo she'ili. Why does the borrower even have to pay half? Why can't the borrower make a claim and say, I wanted to borrow an ox. I didn't want to borrow a lion, right? If I knew it was mu'ad, I would not have borrowed it at all because it's more wild, and I didn't even want to pay half because if it was a shor tam, then I would have treated it like a shor tam, which probably will not gore at all. Whereas if I knew it was wild like a lion, then I would not have taken it at all, and so I should have to pay nothing. Rav says that's a good claim. You're right, and this case must only be where he knew already that it was a violent and damaging ox. It wasn't legally yet a mu'ad for technical reasons. Maybe the witnesses didn't come, but the owner, the borrower, knew that it's been goring, it's acting in a wild way. So he knew what he was getting into, and he knew that he would have to, watch it, and he was taking on that risk. But nevertheless, the borrower could make a claim and say that, okay, although I knew it was violent, still I wanted a tam and not a mu'ad. I wanted to limit my liability to only half, even if it should do something. I never agreed that I would pay a whole amount as a mu'ad. So we answer, Mishum damar le, sof sof itam hava palga nizka ba'et shalom hastaname zil shalem palga nizka. So to the owner can say, okay, in the end, so you thought it was a tam and you were willing to accept upon yourself the responsibility to pay half? Okay, so that's what I'm asking you to pay is only half. Right, you would have had to pay half, so therefore now still pay half, right? Even though you thought it was a tam, and now it turns out to be mu'ad, but you still are obligated to pay half if it were tam anyway. But the borrower can still make a claim and say, no, if it was really tam, my liability would be limited to the body of the animal. But now that it's mu'ad, and now this is unlimited liability, and I have to take from my own property. But the owner can say, answer to that and say, Mishum damar le, sof sof at lav Torah ba'it shadome lididi. You still have to pay the ox to me. In other words, the borrower will have to pay the nizak from the body of the ox. And let's say the whole thing needs to be paid. Oh, so fine, here, just take the ox, and fine, his liability would be limited to that. But nevertheless, the borrower still has to pay the owner back from his own property for the ox. He still has to give the ox back, and so he's still going to have to take property from his own land, and therefore it makes no difference. Even if it were tam, he would have to give it back, and so he's not losing out anymore now that it's mu'ad, and he has to pay, and he's paying half. Okay, itam hava modina umi patrina. Okay, this borrower has every claim under the sun. He says, if I knew it was tam, then I would have gone and admitted, and I wouldn't have to pay, because the chasi nezek of a short tam is a fine, and the general law about fines is if one admits to it, then you don't have to pay. So I would have ran to the court and admitted what happened, and I wouldn't have paid. But now that it turns out to be a mu'ad, I wasn't able to do that. That's one opinion that says that it's a fine. There is another opinion that says chasi nezek of a short tam is in fact damages. And so even admitting it, he would still have to pay. But even according to that opinion, so this borrower, he knows every which way. As his name I could have found a loophole, and I could have taken the animal, if it were tam, and hidden it in the marsh, and then when the nizak comes, I would have said, well, you can only collect from the body of the goring animal, and it's not here, I don't know where it is, right? Go find it. But he's going to hide it out the whole time. So he could have used this loophole to avoid paying, but if it's a mu'ad, he can't do that, because for a mu'ad, he has to pay from his best land. And so he could have done that. So we accept all these answers, even though this is not exactly a very straightforward way of avoiding paying. Nevertheless, well, technically he could have, and so he has a valid claim. So you know what? You're right. This whole baraita is only talking about a case where the Bet Din first goes and seizes the ox before anything to make sure that he will pay. Some versions have not Bet Din, but Baal Din, that the nizak goes and claims it. Okay, either way, the point is that because it's a case like that, there the borrower now loses the claim. He can't say that I would have admitted. Admission only works before payment. And he can't say I would have hidden it because it's already in the possession of the Bet Din or of the nizak, so he would not be able to hide it. And therefore, he loses out on that claim. In such a case, the owner can say, well, listen, you would have to pay half damages no matter what. And therefore, so what? I didn't tell you I didn't tell you it was a mu'ad, but you still have to pay half damages because you would have had to pay half damages even if it were tam. Okay, good. So all that explains the claim of the borrower. But now we're going to go the other way. The owner can also have a claim and say, why do I have to pay half? If in fact it was taken by the Bet Din before the judgment, then why does the owner have to pay half nezek? Nemale at paste letorai bida man de la masina lashtu yedina behadeh. The owner could go to the borrower and says, why'd you let my ox get seized by the court? Now I can't engage in litigation and a compromise. See, if we had it, and for me, I would have held on to it and not let them take it. And if so, I would have had more leverage, and I could have made a compromise. I could have made a deal with them. I'll pay you this amount, and they would have agreed, because then that way they could avoid having to go through the whole court case. And so he could say, I don't want to pay half. It's your problem because it was seized from you. And the answer to that is mishum damar le'i ahadarte nihalach lav mina chavu shakli le. The borrower can say, okay, and if I returned it to you, then the court would have come and taken it from you. So either way, it would have been at the court, and you still wouldn't have had anything for that leverage. So that makes no difference, the fact that it was taken from my house. It could have equally been taken from your house. Oh, but maybe the borrower could say, yeah, but if you returned it to my house, I would have went and hidden it in the marsh. And that way I could have avoided it being taken. And the answer is, Mishum damar le sof sof lav me'aliyah havu mishtalemi. Yeah, but the borrower can say, yeah, but in the end, you, the owner, knew it was mu'ad, and you have to pay from your own superior quality land. So it doesn't help if you hide it. So it doesn't matter. The Bet Din can still come after your property. So hiding it doesn't help you. And therefore, you would have to pay no matter what. Okay, good. Fine that. All this answer would be good where the owner actually does have other property. But let's say he has no other property. Besides this ox, he has no land. He doesn't own anything at all. So he would say, oh, you should have... I don't have to pay, because if you returned the ox to me, I would have hidden the ox, and they have no other property that they could have taken it from, and I would have not had to pay at all. And the answer to that is Mishum damar leki hechad mish ta'abadna ledidach hachename mish ta'abadna leheach. And the borrower can say, yeah, but just like I'm indebted to you, I'm also indebted to the injured party. In other words, I don't have to pay you so that then you will pay the injured party. I can pay it directly. Rabbi Natan, Detanya Rabbi Natan Omer, Minay lenoshe b'chavero maneh, v'chavero b'chavero, Minay shemosin mizeh v'noim lazeh, Tamod Omar, Natan la asher asham lo. Rabbi Natan says in general, if A owes B money and B owes C money, C doesn't have to go to B. C can go directly to A and say, listen, you owe B, but he owes me. And so pay me directly, and he can extract money directly from his debtor's debtor, and so that's what's happening now. The Nizak says, listen, you have to pay the owner, so your ox, you have to pay me. Yeah, but he has no money. It doesn't matter. He can go after the borrower, because the borrower has to give it to the owner, and the owner has to give it to the Nizak, and so Nizak can get it directly. So even if the owner has no money, still the borrower would be on the hook for it, and therefore can give it over directly. All right, so we solved the problems and all the possible claims, and we understand why in the Resha each one has to pay half. But now let's explain the sefa. Huad bebet shoel vechizro la be'alim b'shalim chasinez v'yeshol patur mikelum. Here it was a short tam, and then at the borrower, while it was under the borrower, it gored 3 times and became a mu'ad, and then it goes back to the owner and gores. So the owner has to pay only as a short tam chasinezek, and the borrower, even though the borrower is responsible for making it from a tam to mu'ad, does not have to pay anything. So why is that? It seems sefa reshut mishana, resha reshut ena mishana. It seems that the sefa is assuming that a change in custody changes its status, and so even though it was mu'ad when it was under the borrower, when it goes back to the owner, it goes back to being tam. But the resha did not assume that, because in the resha it was mu'ad under the owner, and then he gave it over to the borrower, and it remained mu'ad. It didn't become tam; it was mu'ad, and that's why each one has to to pay half. So it seems that the Resha is assuming that a change in custody does not change the status of the ox, and the Sefa thinks that it does change. So what's going on? There's two different assumptions in two halves of the Baraita. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Tabra Misha Shana Zo Lo Shana Zo. Rabbi Yochanan says, indeed, this Baraita is disjointed, and the one who taught the first half is a different person who taught the second half. They're actually two different authors, and they were just smashed together because they happen to be about the same topic. Rabba Amar Mideresha Reshut Ena Mishana Sefa Name Reshut Ena Mishana. Rabba doesn't like that answer, and he says, no, if the Resha is assuming that it does not change status, so to the Sefa does not think it changes status. So that means that it became a mu'ad under the borrower, it remains mu'ad. So therefore, why does the borrower not have to pay half, since it is mu'ad, or the owner pay a full amount? Mishum damar le lav kol keminach ya'ad le torai. Because the owner can say to the borrower, it's not within your power to make it forewarned, right? You were just borrowing it, and so your negligence caused it, but that you don't have the power to change it when it's under your custodianship. It cannot possibly become a shor mu'ad from my perspective. So therefore, from the perspective of the owner, it never became a shor tam. It's not that it's a shor mu'ad now by definition, and then it changes back into a shor tam when it goes back into the custody of the owner, because we're not assuming that. We're assuming that change in status, as change in ownership, does not change the status. So it's not that it's changing the status, but rather, from the perspective of the owner, he gave it as a shor tam, and it remains a shor tam for him, because the borrower doesn't have the power to change its status for the owner. Okay, so that's how Rabba explains it. Papa Amar Midisefa Reshut Mishana Reshana Me Reshut Mishana. The Papa says the opposite, that since the Sefa assumes that the status does change, so too the Resha also assumes that the status does change when it changes ownership. And therefore, even though the borrower, it was a mu'ad under the borrower, it was mu'ad under the owner, and then he gave it over to the borrower, why doesn't it change? Because it didn't actually change ownership. When the owner gives it to the borrower, everybody goes around, everybody still refers to it as, oh, whose ox is that? It's the owner's ox. Oh, the other guy's just borrowing it for a little while. It does not really changing ownership. It's different if you sell it or inherit it, and it goes to a different owner altogether. Here, it remains under the same ownership, and therefore, whatever its status was before, which was mu'ad, it remains a mu'ad, and ownership does not change, and borrowing is not the same as changing ownership, and therefore it remains mu'ad. We now go back to the end of the Mishnah that says, Shora istadin eno chayav mita, that a stadium ox is not put to death. Even though it gored and kills a person, and normally the ox would be killed, but since here it was instigated by its handlers to go and be more violent than an ox normally would be, so it's not the ox's fault, and it is not put to death. Okay, so we know that it's not put to death, but what about offering it as a sacrifice? Even though it's involved in a sin, can it be offered as a sacrifice? It's a machloket. Rav amar kasher, u'Shmuel amar pasul. Rav amar kasher anusu, u'Shmuel amar pasul hare ne'avad bo avera. Rav said it's fine. Shmuel said it's not. Rav said it's okay to make it as a sacrifice, because even though it killed a person, and normally an animal that's involved in a sin does not get sacrificed, nevertheless, it's not its fault. It's beyond its control. It was trained to do so. And Shmuel said it cannot be offered as a sacrifice, since a sin was committed through it. Whether or not it was nature or was his fault, doesn't matter. It was, even if it was the tool that people used to commit a sin, nevertheless, this is an animal involved in a sin, and therefore is not appropriate to offer as sacrifice to God. We're going to have a challenge against Shemuel who says that you cannot offer it. So the question is going to be a long one. Metive mina behema lo sieta robeya vetan nirba mina baka lo sieta ne'ibad mina son lo sieta mukse mina son lo sieta nogeach. The Torah says that you can bring an animal from behema, and it describes the animals that can be brought as a sacrifice. So, but since it says meaning only some of them, it's also exclusionary. So behema, that phrase excludes any animal that is involved in bestiality, either as the active or passive partner. Mina bakar excludes an animal that is worshipped as an idolatrous way. And mina son excludes an animal that is set aside for worship, even if it was not actually worshipped, it was set aside for idol worship. And mina son excludes nogeach, an animal that gores and kills a person. All right, that's if it kills a person on purpose. Amar Rabbi Shimon, im ne'emar robeya, nama ne'emar nogeach, im ne'emar nogeach, lama ne'emar robeya. Rabbi Shimon asks, why do we need to exclude both a roveya and a nogeach? Both of them get the same punishment, that they get stoned. So why can't the Torah just tell us one of them? And then I could figure, well, if this one does not qualify to become a sacrifice, then the other one also, the same thing, I could figure it out myself. And the answer is, there are certain laws that apply to the one engaged in bestiality that do not apply to an animal that kills, and vice versa. Each one has a stringency that I might say, oh, that's why this one, it doesn't get sacrificed, but the other one has a leniency, and say, well, maybe therefore that one could get sacrificed. What are the stringencies in both? Robeya asa bo ones kirason, nogeach lo asa bo ones kirason. And bestiality is more stringent because the law is the same whether the animal is forced into it or it does it on its own. Forced into it, it's the receiving partner, kirason if it's the active partner. The result is the same. In both cases, it cannot be sacrificed. But that's not true for nogeach, where it's not the same, ones and rason. In that case, whether it kills on its own or was forced to instigate it into killing, the law is the same. It cannot be sacrificed. This is the source of the challenge against Shemuel. But first, we have to finish the whole braita. If an animal gores and kills, the owner has to pay ransom. But if it's involved in bestiality, the owner does not have to pay ransom. So in that sense, a robeya is more lenient, and therefore you might think that even though nogeach is not offered as a sacrifice, maybe a robeya is offered as a sacrifice. So that's why he has to say robeya. So that's why you need both of them. That's why the Torah needs exclusionary phrases to teach me both of them, because I could not learn one from the other. That's the end of the braita. Now here's the challenge. Simhat robeya asabo ones kerason, nogeach lo asabo ones kerason. It says that for robeya, it doesn't matter if it's done to it or does it willingly, but for killing, it does make a difference whether it did it on its own. There it cannot be sacrificed. But if it's instigated and does it against its will, then it can be sacrificed. This is a challenge to Shemuel, who said it cannot be sacrificed. And when we make this comparison over here, isn't this talking about in the context of can you bring it as a korban or not? And so this is a challenge to Shemuel, who said you cannot bring it as a korban. According to this, if it's honest, then you can bring it as a korban. And we answer, la liktala. No, this comparison, you thought it was talking about differences regarding sacrificability. No, it was actually differences between whether the animal deserves a death penalty. If an animal is involved in bestiality, no matter what, even honest, it deserves a death penalty. But when it comes to killing, when it comes to a death penalty, right, if it kills another animal, then you only give the death penalty if it does it willingly, but not honest. That was the whole halacha that our Mishnah had taught in the first place. And therefore, there's no challenge to Shemuel. And this explanation of the Baraita, we're not just backing into it to save Shemuel. It actually is the better reading. Di amart lekorban nogeach lo asa bo ones kerason lav ones dide ketiv velav rason dide ketiv ela lav diktala. Because if you say it's talking about korban, well, regarding an animal that kills, and that the fact that there is a distinction between ones and rason, well, that the law of ones of it killing is regarding korban is not mentioned in the pasuk, nor if it kills on purpose is it mentioned explicitly whether you can give it or not in the pasuk. So the fact that we're bringing it like, oh, this we know, like we know this one has a leniency. Well, the whole thing that we're trying to learn too is whether or not the owner has to bring korban in these cases. That's actually the question that we're asking. Do you have to? And we're deriving it from the law of the death penalty for the animal. So you can only learn from something you know to something you don't know. What we do know is the law regarding death penalty. That's the law it says in the Mishnah. The Mishnah brought a pasuk also for it, and that's the leniency and stringency is regarding the death penalty. So this whole comparison is regarding death penalty and is not about korban. So therefore, the korban is not said in the Torah, and that's why it's ambiguous, and therefore there's no challenge here to Shemuel. All right, now that we solved that, we're just going to analyze one part of this. Baraita amar mon nogech meshalem et hakofer, obeya eno meshalem et hakofer. Whereas an animal that kills, the owner has to pay ransom, but an animal that is involved in bestiality, the owner does not pay kofir. What is the case? So generally, ransom is associated with killing someone. Because it killed someone, therefore, the owner is liable to ransom. So in this case, did it kill someone or not? In case of bestiality. If it sinned with bestiality and through that act also killed let's say the woman that it was with, so then, well, what's the difference how it kills it? The keren with the horn is just an example. But anyway, that the animal kills is going to deserve kofir. So it really doesn't matter the fact that it did it also in the act of bestiality. It still is murder, and therefore, it still is killing, and therefore the owner would certainly have to pay ransom. So it can't be that case. But if the animal committed only bestiality and didn't kill the woman who's the victim, then the fact that it doesn't pay ransom, that's only because it didn't kill her. Right? There's the law of ransom is not within the category of bestiality. Bestiality is not going to require ransom. So therefore, it's not a chidush. It's not really a leniency in this law. The fact that for Ribi'ah there is no payment of kofir, that's not a leniency. It's just in the wrong category, and then you wouldn't bring it as a comparative leniency. So what is the case? We have two answers. Amar Bayele olam de Rab'ah vela ketala de'achuha lebedina vekatluha maudetema kema dekatla dame kamashmalan. Abaye says we're talking about a case where the animal did Ribi'ah with the woman, but didn't kill it. The animal didn't kill it, but then because this woman was involved in a sin with an animal, let's say she was willing participant, and so then she's brought to Betin, and Betin gives her capital punishment. So I might have thought that the owner of the animal is indirectly responsible for the death penalty given to the woman because she got the death penalty for sinning with the owner's animal. And so I might have thought that the owner does have to give the ransom for that act because it's like he killed her, and therefore Kamash Malan. That's why the Baraita has to teach us that not so. The owner of an animal only has to pay ransom if the animal act itself directly kills an animal, not if it just was involved in a sin for which the woman got the death penalty later in court. Okay, that's Abaye's answer. Rava Amar leolam de Rav uveketala. Udeka kashyalach mali ketala bekanai mali ketala beribi'a keren kavanato lehazik. Hai kavanato lehanat asmohu. Rava says, in fact, the case is that the animal killed her in the course of bestiality. And that which you asked, well, what's the difference if it killed it with its horn or killed it through an act of bestiality? After all, it killed it, so therefore it shouldn't make a difference, and the owner should have to pay a ransom either way. Oh, Rabba says, I have an answer. There is a difference between them. If an animal kills someone through keren, that means it had intent to cause damage. It got angry, and that's why it's liable. The owner is liable for kofir. But this animal was not in a violent mood. Its intention was to have pleasure for itself, and ended up killing her. But it wasn't because it wasn't its intention to cause damage, and therefore it is different, and the owner does not have to pay ransom. Okay, so Rava explains it that way. Now, b'mai pelige, what would be a practical case that would be a difference between Abaye and Rava? Beregel shedarsal gabe tinok b'chasar hanizak, l'Abaye meshalem kofer, l'Rava lo meshalem kofer. If you have an animal that's walking normally and in the courtyard of a nizak and steps on a baby and kills it in that courtyard, well, would the owner be liable to pay ransom? According to Abaye, yes, you would have to pay because it still killed it. Doesn't matter why it killed it. If an animal kills a person, the owner has to pay kofir no matter what. But Rava makes a distinction between why. If it kills it violently, then you have to pay kofir. But if it's killing it while it's doing its own thing, it's just walking for pleasure, then you do not have to. And so here, where it's just walking and it's not doing it violently to cause damage, the owner does not have to pay for the ransom. Tanya kivate de Rav, and now back to the original machloket, where Rav says that it is fit to bring as an offering an animal that is incited to kill. We have a braita that supports it. Shora istadin eno chayav mita v'chasher legabe mizbeach mipnei shehu kim oseh. An animal that performs in a stadium and kills, the owner is the animal itself does not get the death penalty because it's anus, it's not his fault, and you can bring it as a sacrifice on the mizbeach. Why? Because it was compelled to do so. It did not do so on its own. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.